is 1960, and the Aurora Space Program has just unveiled its newest launch vehicle, the Kuruk 2, an improvement in almost every way upon the Kuruk 1, the most notable of which being the use of the LR-91 second stage engine currently burning before you. This engine gives the Kuruk 2 approximately the same delta-V and mass to orbit as the Kuruk 1, but in a far more efficient and cheap manner. The Kuruk 2 is designed as a quick, simple, 1-ton launch vehicle for future flights, and the Aurora Space Program will be eager to utilize it, as will the United States military. Of course, this is the first launch of 1960, and I should introduce it. This is the Globestar 1, the first communications satellite that is going to be sent up by the Navcom Corporation in coordination with the United States government on top of the Kuruk 2. Now, this is our first foray into communications in low Earth orbit. However, of course, Navcom will be taking over operations of this satellite once its final orbit has been reached, which is unfortunate, as the Aurora Space Program would have much liked to be able to utilize its capabilities. And here we are, just as the second stage of the Kuruk 2 is separating, with that mid-AJ-10 upper stage being ready to take the Globestar 1 right on up into orbit. Now, this is a good time to start talking about what has occurred over the winter for the Aurora Space Program. Of course, last year, on September 14th, the Soviet Union would send a probe that would impact the moon. News of this would not get out until the Soviets would publish it slightly later on this year, just as another probe flew by the moon in October. This development would have the United States government questioning what was the Soviets' ambition on the moon. Would it be to establish some sort of military capability there? Were there resources to be had? Of course, the United States government had absolutely no idea, and they were beginning to regret their decision to laugh off Satish Dhawan's plan for lunar exploration. Unfortunately, the time had passed, and the programs that are currently contracted to the Aurora Space Program must be completed if they are to join the Soviets in lunar space. And thus we return to our current mission, the Globestar 1. This is the first of 4 very small missions this year. Unfortunately, the budget allocated to the Aurora Space Program seemed to be shrinking every year. While Congress had allocated the budget for this year, there was no going back at this point, and so the Aurora Space Program would have to make do with the funding that it had. Any extra funding would be used for the next variant of the Kuruk launch vehicle, but in the future, the Congress of the United States would be appropriating funding for lunar launches, and they wanted to finish off this program with the Globestar satellites and the Navcom contracts as soon as possible in order to flesh out the programs and the contracts for the Aurora Space Program going forward. Of course, in order to get to the moon, the Aurora Space Program would need to develop a new launch vehicle anyways. The current Kuruk 2 and the Kuruk 1 are not capable of sending a craft on a translunar trajectory. Unfortunately, they simply do not have the mass-to-orbit capabilities. Word has gotten out that the Soviets are using new variants of their R-7 rockets to take their probes to the moon, and those such heavy lift variants are not within the realm of possibility at this time for the American Aurora Space Program. In spite of lacking this capability that the Soviets already have developed, the Aurora Space Program would plan to have a launch vehicle capable of translunar flights developed and ready by the end of the year. This was a big leap, as it took multiple years for the Kuruk-2 to finally be completed, finally culminating in 1960 launch date. Unfortunately, the plan just could not be sped up any further. All this time would be needed for the Kuruk-3 to be developed, and then a Kuruk Heavy variant for potential landing missions in the future. The engineers would plan for approximately 3 tons to low Earth orbit for the Kuruk-3, and for the Kuruk-3 Heavy variant, it would be approximately 5 tons to low Earth orbit. A far cry from the early space program when we were largely sending less than 50 kilograms to low Earth orbit. We have come quite a long way. Unfortunately, it will take some time for that to be developed, and so a test mission would be planned out for the end of the year. And now we see the final success of the Globestar satellite reaching orbit just as it had intended. It remained attached to the lower stage to prevent any further movement, as it needed a very precise orbit for the contract to be fulfilled. And here we begin with the flight of the X-5DT. This is Gwen back in the cockpit. As you may recall, last year Gwen was grounded by the US military until Ernest and Stacy had completed their contracts with the Aurora Space Program. And unfortunately, that time has come to pass. Ernest and Stacy are no longer with us. Not in a devastating or sad way, unfortunately. Nothing bad has happened to them, but they are no longer in the program, having retired from their duties in the Aurora Space Program. This mission, largely a test flight of the X-5, was to send it above 140 kilometers. There's no required contract to do this, and the X-5 was easily more than capable of doing this, but Gwen wanted to get some more experience and test out the X-5 for herself, seeing as she never got to fly it last year. This plane, once again, uses the XLR-99 to propel itself into a higher than ever altitude. You can see Gwen tries to reignite the engine, but unfortunately the roll is being induced on the plane by its pitch rate. This is something that could not be corrected for with the RCS thrusters without wasting all of the fuel, some of which would be needed in case we came back in at a poor trajectory. Luckily, it would not be required, as we performed the proper belly flop maneuver coming back in, Gwen being an excellent pilot that she is, and she would attempt to land at Tampa Bay, the airport just off the east coast of Florida, or the west coast, of Florida. Unfortunately, the downrange capabilities of the X-5 are very, very limited, especially when coming down from such a ballistic arc trajectory. It loses a lot of horizontal velocity very quickly, and it starts to drop like a rock, very much like the real-world space shuttle. And reluctantly, Gwen would decide to pull the emergency parachute on board the X-5 very close to the ground. This is what needed to be done in order to save the vehicle and potentially save her life. And on April 15th of 1960, the TN-9 would be launched aboard the Kuruk-2-1. This is a new variant of the Kuruk-2 launch vehicle, and it has a single strap-on Castor 1 solid rocket motor. This gave us the additional 100 or 150 delta V in meters per second that we required to reach the designated orbit for the TN-9, which would be the Aurora Space Program's first and only scientific satellite launched in 1960. And here we can see the results of the Karuk program. This is something that the Aurora Space Program was working towards with the Ahote boosters, and then finally with the Karuk-1, we reached its pinnacle. We have begun the standardization of rockets. This is something that the United States never quite figured out in these early years of rocketry. Most rockets were different up until the Titan II launch vehicles, and each vehicle was designed around the payload that it was bringing to orbit. The Aurora Space Program would like to contrast this and design rockets that are capable of launching a wide variety of payloads with simple configurable options, like a different upper stage or a different lower stage. This one would rely on a different lower stage variant of the Karuk 2 launch vehicle with a single strap-on Castor 1 solid rocket motor. While this may seem like it would offset the rocket and send it spiraling out of control, the limited thrust of the Castor 1 alongside with the gimbal of the 4 main LR-89 engines and the control guidance systems of the lower stage of the Karuk 2, all put together, allow the rocket to maintain its heading. Unfortunately, you can see that by the end of the first stage burn, one of the LR-89s had flamed out, just maybe a few seconds before main engine cutoff. And the second stage would separate nominally though, and the LR-91 would begin propelling the spacecraft towards orbit. While this is occurring, now would be a great time to talk about the mission of the TN-9. It's a very simple satellite, but it does change a couple things from our previous programs. The TN-9 would now use a hex-shaped core. This would allow better placement for solar panels on the rocket and allow more coverage for the sun when the craft is rotating. You can see this here now in this view. On the side of the TN-9, there would be a magnetometer boom. This is one of the earliest magnetometers that is available to us, and we would be measuring magnetic data from the Earth's magnetosphere. So the point of this rocket would be to get it to a very, very high orbit with a large eccentricity of approximately 0.75 to 0.80 in eccentricity. And in addition to the magnetometer boom on the TN-9, it would include a micrometeorite scanner. This would allow the TN-9 to detect whether or not there are pockets of empty space in different heights of orbit around the Earth. The point of knowing this would be to assess potential damage to our future satellites and determine the best orbit for specific missions. And here you can see this TN-9 is using its guidance calculator on board to plot the next trajectory that it will be taking. This will be to raise our periapsis to the desired height for our scientific contract. On board this satellite with the magnetometer, there is also a small TV camera to collect data from lower and upper Earth orbit, allowing us to see different perspectives of the Earth. And the modern AJ-10 upper stage, this is our upper stage pusher, capable of pushing around 1 ton in Earth orbit to different orbits, has unlimited reuses and reignitions. This is an engine that will definitely be the workhorse of a program going forward, even potentially into the lunar missions planned for later on. Unfortunately for now, we just have the TN-9 as our sole scientific mission, and we are pushing for more. Maybe next year we will have a couple more to flesh out the scientific packages of the Aurora Space Program, and maybe even one up the Soviets, who have been taking great leaps in the scientific field of space. It really is amazing how these satellites can drift so gracefully in orbit, almost without a care in the world. I suppose they do not have a care in the world, as they are inanimate objects, only animated by the ingenuity of human engineering. But here we are, very close to our target, and the guidance computer is prepared to create a stable orbit for the TN-9. We're warping around to our burn, and the second engine ignites, propelling us towards our future and towards the orbit of the TN-9, which will begin to gather scientific data for us in the coming months. It's really a beautiful pinkish glow given off by the AJ-10. I'm sure that is extremely toxic fuel. Unfortunately, you won't, or perhaps fortunately, we won't have to breathe it in, as it is stuck up there in the upper atmosphere of outer space, almost 3,000 kilometers above the surface. And here we are in slow motion, the second stage separated with just a few hundred meters per second of delta V remaining in that stage, just so that way we can go within the specified orbital parameters. The TN-9 is spun up, and here we are in our desired orbital inclination and eccentricity. And at long last, our TN-9 can now begin transmitting its valuable scientific data to Earth. Before this point, there was no satellite that has ever gone higher than the TN-9. A very impressive feat, and we are very proud of the engineers at the Aurora Space Program for doing so. However, that is not the last flight of 1960. Here we are, December 13th, months later, with the launch of our newest vehicle, the Karuk 3, a beast of a rocket, massive, using 4 LR-89s on the first stage, just as before, and an LR-91 on the second stage, just as the Karuk 2 had done before. This rocket is capable of approximately 3 tons to low Earth orbit, a huge increase in payload capacity, especially in these early days. However, another major factor that is different than the Karuk 2 is that the 3 tons can be brought to low Earth orbit in only 2 stages, whereas the Karuk 2 required 3 stages to do 1 ton to orbit, a huge improvement. However, this rocket does cost a lot of funds to launch, and so it will be limited to only heavier lift missions. And it is a pretty impressive rocket indeed. And here we are, lingering just a bit longer on that first stage booster. Hopefully we'll get to see main engine cutoff here shortly. One thing that I like to note is while this booster is very large, it is capable of doing something that not a lot of rockets before this point were capable of doing, perhaps despite the Soviet Union's capabilities. This rocket could be capable of launching a pod to orbit with a crew on board. Not something that we have in the books just yet, even though it is 1960, and in the real life, 1961 was the launch date of the first crew. It would seem that the United States is growing even further behind on our real-world deadlines. And here we are with the ignition of the LR-91 second stage, propelling our payload towards orbit. You'll see this is a vastly different payload than ones that we are very used to. The AJ-10 upper stage has been converted into a new long-term pusher stage capable of pushing around a very heavy payload indeed. Of course, the total stack of this entire payload accounts for approximately 6 tons or so. Of course, the Karuk 3 is only capable of launching 3 tons towards orbit, you might say. While we will be using that AJ-10 upper stage for a bit of the orbital insertion burn, this allows the LR-91 to fall helplessly down towards the Earth's surface. And as you can see, we're on a bit of a northward trajectory, and hopefully that doesn't fall on some unwitting moose in Canada. We'll see. However, atop of the AJ-10 pusher stage, we have 3 very special payloads. This is a contract for the Navcom Corporation, and these 3 payloads are their first navigational satellites. It's 3 payloads designed to spread themselves out in orbit after being delivered with sufficient distance between each package. On board of the pusher stage, we have also 6 more radial tanks full of nitrogen to allow for extra RCS fuel and extra maneuvering in case of being thrown off course by the new satellites being launched, each on board containing a small solid rocket motor to push it far away from the parent vehicle at a good pace. And it looks quite beautiful out here with the 3 satellites lined up with only millimeters apart in the payload bay. On top of a simple tricoupler stack, here we are clipped just ahead to the second stage or the third stage ignition. Of course, that AJ-10 has never failed us before, a great improvement on the previous AJ-10s, which always seemed to fail at the worst times when you didn't need them to. Luckily, this engine is a great beast and will be working for the Aurora Space Program going forward. Here we are pushing these 3 satellites for the Navcom Corporation into low Earth orbit. These satellites are called Navsat 2 through 4, respectively, and they are small, but they pack a punch. These satellites will be coordinating United States military movements in Europe and beyond, these ones being at a much higher inclination than Navsat 1, that early test bed that we launched last year. Of course, I must have included this full burn for dramatic effect. It seems like this rocket is a beast, dragging these satellites through into Earth orbit. Hopefully next year or the year after, we'll see a launch of a telecommunications network just to match the navigations network that Navcom has already worked on. Though it is very impressive, here we are, fully reached orbit. Now we get a glimpse at the computer at work, performing a few maneuvers in Earth orbit to try and fix up their trajectory, make it a little bit more circular, that is, so that way the satellites have a bit better time communicating and planning out their own trajectories with their onboard reaction control systems. A very simple system, but the pusher stage was designed with the computer needed to do all of this work so the payloads could be delivered with the minimal stress to the corporation. Even though Navcom, the corporation, seems to be really taking up a lot of the space on Aurora Space Program launches that could have been used for scientific payloads, it seems that Aurora Space Program doesn't want to leave a sour taste in anyone's mouth, and we are devoted to delivering a great product for all of our customers, even in spite of their more sinister intentions. And the NavSat payload bus is going to be performing its final burn, putting these satellites into the desired orbit. Now it is up to each satellite, after they separate, to spread themselves out a little bit. Of course, we will attempt to do as best as we can, but we must be keeping in mind that each satellite would have a better and easier time separating themselves over a longer period of time than we would trying to do this on our payload bus, which is only capable of having battery for a short period of time. Of course, these NavSats are specialized to endure long periods of time in outer space, and Navcom is more than capable of handling that on their own. They simply need our help to get them up there. I suppose now that we're coming to the end of this mission, it's a good time to talk about something I would like to apologize for. This is a very short year, only 4 launches, if you can even consider that, one being a non-contracted flight of the X-5 by Gwen. I know, something very sad to see. You might have wanted a few more launches this year. It's not something that I could have helped, unfortunately, and as I said at the beginning of the video, Satish Dhawan had been laughed out of Congress last year, and our budget is set, unfortunately, a little too late. The Americans now realize a bit the error of their ways, where the Soviets are far more capable and are performing feats that the Americans thought probably unlikely. But now we're stuck. We're stuck doing Navcom's bidding, and next year perhaps we'll get some of those scientific payloads that the United States government promised us, but I won't spoil anything. I'll try to keep it on the down low. I think this, though, is a beautiful mission, and I think this year was a year of firsts. We saw the first debut of the Karuk 2, which is going to be a new mainstay launch vehicle for the Aurora Space Program, capable of being modular, performing different missions, and really just approaching any possibility with low Earth orbit. It is capable of doing quite a bit. I'm very proud of the Karuk 2 and its capabilities. All we need to do for different missions is strap on different solid rocket motors, and with its control probe core on the first stage, it is more than capable of handling quite a few solid rocket motors, up to around 6, I believe, and that is a huge amount of possibility. And we also debuted the Karuk 3, a huge launch vehicle capable of performing quite well in near Earth space, potentially even into outer space, deep space that is. And I suppose we'll see about that in the coming years. I hear that the Soviets may be working on a program to send probes towards Venus and Mars, and I'm sure that will get the folks in Congress kicking and allocating a few extra bucks to the Aurora Space Program. I must thank you, though, for watching this episode, even in spite of its shorter nature, and I hope that you all come back for 1961 and the 1-decade anniversary of our program. I can't believe it's almost been 10 episodes already. Thank you so much for those of you who have been watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.